Super, well, we'll get started. Thanks so much for joining us. We are gonna look at what's going on in Washington these days. What isn't going on in Washington, I suppose, is probably a better question. I think it's fair to say that no election has done more to promote cybersecurity awareness than the last one, so that's a good thing, right? It's still a little bit unclear how those sort of cybersecurity experiences and all that awareness is going to manifest itself as the administration gets its sea legs, but we will explore that today. Cybersecurity used to be a boring bipartisan issue. It's become one of the most politically charged issues there is. That often has sort of an inverse relationship to making progress, so we'll kind of talk about how that dynamic is playing out today. The White House has recently unveiled the much delayed executive order, which is something certainly that we can talk about and discuss. And it'll also be interesting to hear what our panelists think of how the administration is starting to staff up as well in cybersecurity. We are basically going to look today at what we can expect ahead. Today's panel is going to help us assess the current state of cybersecurity policy and provide guidance on how to make sense of it all. To do that, we have Rob Knake, who is a senior advisor at Versive, which is a predictive analytics company. There, he advises them on the development of their security applications. Prior to that, he was working at the National Security Council in the Obama administration as Director for Cybersecurity Policy, where he worked on a range of issues from critical infrastructure to the development of the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center and a range of other cybersecurity policy issues. He is also a lecturer at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mike Steed is founder and managing partner of Paladin Capital Group, where he serves as chairman of the Paladin Cyber Fund and the Paladin 3 investment committees. He was previously senior vice president of investments at Ulico Inc., which is a financial services holding company in the DC area. And prior to that, in the 80s, he served as special counsel to the chairman of the DNC, which has been in the news for cybersecurity reasons. He's also a founding member of the National Democratic Institute. Jack Tomarchio is a principal at the Agoge Group, which is an international strategic advisory firm. And there he advises on trends and changes in geopolitical markets, as well as defense, homeland security, and cybersecurity issues. Prior to that, he was a partner at Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney, where he co-chaired the law firm's cybersecurity practice group. And prior to that, I knew him back when he was in the Bush administration at DHS, where he was principal deputy undersecretary for intelligence and analysis operations. DHS has not improved its naming conventions, by the way, where, among other things, he worked to develop the intelligence sharing networks with state and local officials. So just to kick it off, I'm wondering, just sort of broadly, how you'd characterize the Trump administration's sort of overall approach and strategy, so to speak, with cybersecurity. We can just kind of go down the line. Rob.
So let me start with the executive order that just came out. Some people really kind of roundly criticized it for sort of not doing much, ordering a series of reports. My view is you have to grade them on a curve, and the curve begins with the campaign and goes through the transition and into the inauguration. And if you look at it that way, when candidate Trump started talking about the cyber, right, it was in the context of we're going on the offensive, we're going to allow companies to hack back. This got into the Republican platform. After the election.
What about the 400-pound hacker?
The 400-pound hacker. We still haven't found the 400-pound. We thought attribution was getting better. But so if you look at it from that standpoint, after the transition, or in the transition, you saw the Trump campaign say we have a 10-point plan for what we're going to do in our first 100 days. They talked about cyber, and their main mission was to say, okay, we're going to move all this responsibility out of civilian agencies and to the Department of Defense. So from that standpoint, by the time you started seeing these draft executive orders coming out, they were getting better and better. And the one that just came out last week, I think the answer is to say that they've dispensed with all these alternative notions, and they found themselves back where the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the Obama administration have been. We're going to focus on a public-private partnership. We're going to focus on civilian agencies. We're not going to make this a DoD issue. And really what this executive order is about is implementing policy that was written and started in the Obama administration. So from my perspective, I think that's actually a pretty good outcome.
So he's endorsed the Obama administration?
I mean, absolutely. That executive order references the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, EO 13636, and a host of other initiatives for federal agency cybersecurity. It was also written by people who were carryovers, career civil servants, and so I think it is a firm endorsement of the Obama administration approach.
And also an indication as to why personnel matters. Mike, what do you think? What's the overall strategy that we're seeing emerge?
Well, I think Rob has it right. There was an act of God that took place the first week of President Trump's administration when somebody reached in, took that executive order off of his desk so he didn't sign it because it was really bad. And I think from that point on to where it is now, it's gotten pretty good. I think you have to focus on the people, though. Ultimately, you can have all the orders, you can have all the plans, but you have to focus on the people. So we feel pretty good about the people. So we've got Mathis, we have Kelly, we've got McMaster. These are three generals. They understand that the first priority after nuclear is cyber. As a matter of fact, for the people here, the Secretary of Treasury, when he was asked, what is your first issue as Secretary of Treasury, the word cyber came out of his mouth. So there's a greater awareness than we've seen, I think, in the past. With Bossert in the White House, directly in the White House, you've got a team of people at Defense, Homeland Security, National Security, CIA, NSA, and at Treasury that really understand what needs to be done. The real problem, though, is that in this executive order, there's 15 reports that have to be delivered over a period of time. And there's very few appointments below the levels of the gentleman that I've just identified where this work gets done. There's very few people that are in place to do it. So whether they can get it in time or not, and whether it's going to have the kind of focus that we hope that it'll have, is going to be questionable because they don't have the people in place to really work those 15 reports.
Jack.
Well, I think that several things. I agree that with Rob that when candidate Trump talked about cyber as being, or the cyber as being one of the biggest priorities, he promised he would deliver a plan within 90 days. That didn't happen. That's okay. I would have been surprised if, frankly, if any candidate who then became president would be able to roll out a plan on something as comprehensive and important as a national cybersecurity policy within 90 days. I was okay with that. And certainly, I think that, as my colleagues have said, I am encouraged at the people that he's put in to run the cyber policy. I worked with Tom Bossert from my time in the Bush administration. He's a good guy. He's easy to work with. He's a young guy. Everybody's younger than me. But he's a good guy, and I think he understands the issues. I know General McMaster. I think he looks at the whole cyber optic as part and parcel of a greater defense optic that he has to deal with as a national security advisor. I think that you will see essentially a lot of continuity between what was done in the Bush administration and the Obama administration now going into the Trump administration with regard to cybersecurity. And I think that's okay. I don't think something like this, you come in and every 4 years you scrap it and you do something new. You have to build upon the work that's been done by the prior administrations. I think we will see, probably because of President Trump's commercial bias, his background, I think you'll see a greater desire for public-private partnership in this area. I think that the President and those who are going to effectuate the cyber policy will also use a carrot as opposed to a stick approach when they deal with the private sector, to allow the private sector to get buttoned up, so to speak, in the cyber way, to get greater awareness and greater ability to comply with cybersecurity protocols. I don't think it's going to be draconian. I think it's going to be, again, more of a carrot than a stick.
We've heard about public-private partnership in cybersecurity since we started talking about cybersecurity policy. What does that actually start looking like, do you think? Jack, maybe take that first because you raised it.
That's a great question. I don't have the answer for that. I think certainly the public-private partnership is something that everybody talks about. There's a lot of good lip service about that. I think once you get down into the weeds, especially with regard to privacy and what that means with regard to large companies owning large tranches of data and information about people and consumers' private life and habits online, I think that you run into some thickets there. So I don't think that it's going to be an easy solution. I think it's going to be a solution that's going to take a lot of hard work, both from the USG, the U.S. government folks, but also from the private sector, and also a lot of the privacy advocates that are really kind of the third estate here in that triumvirate.
Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, let me unpack what public-private partnership is shorthand for, because it's a bit of cover language. I mean, what it really means is that private companies are responsible for their own network security, even if the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and international criminal groups are coming after them, right? That the government does not step in at any point and say, okay, it's gotten too hot for you, it's our problem now, right? That's just not how the internet works. That's how U.S. law is set up. And so really what it means is the U.S. government is in a supporting function on cybersecurity, right? You're going to have to protect yourself. This used to really annoy my boss, Michael Daniel, because he hated this, but I would say, it's the Home Depot model, right? You can do it, we can help. Government's in this supporting role, right? We'll do the law enforcement, we'll do the diplomacy, we can do economic sanctions, we can bring the private sector together, we can try and nudge them along, but fundamentally, there is no Great Firewall of the United States. And so what does that mean? It means that fundamentally, you've got to protect your own networks. And by the way, that means protect them, not take the fight to the enemy, right? You don't get to do that under US law. And so that's the basis of the public-private partnership. What I'm hoping the next phase of this is how we create more collaboration between government and the private sector. How we can do things like move more quickly to do botnet takedowns. And that's one of the most encouraging things in the executive order is they're really looking for mechanisms by which the government and the private sector can work together. So I think that's a very positive thing.
I think that's all good to say, but the answer to the question is tomorrow, if there's an attack against the critical infrastructure of the United States, it's not the government that can protect you. It's not the government that can protect you. So there's got to be a change in what the prior private partnerships delivered. There has to be a real sea change in here. First, we've got to take a look at the intelligence community's authorities. What can they do or what can't they do? This has not been looked at for a long period of time. So the question is how can they act or react? Secondly, we've got to pretend that this is, we have to stop pretending that this isn't costly. The government has got to provide huge amounts of money to invest in the technologies that are going to be adopted by private companies that own and operate this area. They're going to have to do that. One of the encouraging things, there's three parts of the executive order. There's cybersecurity of federal networks, cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, cybersecurity for the nation, and in the area of cybersecurity for the critical infrastructure, if we don't break and reform that past public-private partnerships by investments, by creating new authorities for government agencies to act on behalf of the critical infrastructure, and by providing a massive amount of investment support, it might become so costly that the government will have to pay for those investments and then just deliver them to the businesses. I mean, these are radical thinkings, but I can tell you one NSA director who's out in his backyard one afternoon on a Saturday doing a barbecue, and he gets a call from the head of one of the major telecommunication companies in the world. 35% of the top security telecommunications goes across those lines and said, we are under attack, please do something. And his response was, well, call me on Monday and tell me how it turned out for you. Think about that for a minute. So now they had previously told them what they needed to do to try to make sure they protected their networks to do the kinds of things they needed to do. They had talked about those programs. I think you're going to see a third area. So if the first is to get a set of new authorities for the intelligence community, the second is investment. I think the third area is you're going to have to see a mandatory regulations passed. And again, I don't like mandatory regulations other than anybody else, but if you don't have every company in a particular area that controls critical infrastructure, let's take, for example, one of the areas that's highlighted in the executive order, which is the electrical systems. You know, the weakest link can take down everybody. It's kind of what the thinking is. Now the point is you're going to have more mandatory requirements. I think here in the state of New York, they have mandatory requirements now that have been promulgated for the financial services industry. You're going to see more and more and more of that, so you need to get ready to be able to adopt yourselves and or impact what those authorities are. So I think the public-private partnership is a great idea. Many times you see it on the campaign and everybody talks about it and it sounds great. I think it has worked in some respects for the cybersecurity. Now it needs to be retooled, I believe, taking into consideration those three things.
When you're talking about more regulation, do you mean at the federal level, or do you mean that you're going to start seeing more states stepping up the way that New York has?
Well, I think the state of New York stepped up because it was failure at the federal level. Mm-hmm. There were bills inside of the United States Senate that would have impacted some portion of this, but it was vehemently opposed by the Chamber of Commerce, and it was defeated.
Right. That's why I don't know with this Congress and this White House if you're
So we don't know, and maybe it takes something catastrophic to happen, unfortunately, but I think that there are people on the state level. So what's happened in our country is the federal level doesn't work, largely doesn't work, and so the states now are adopting things that they think they need, and you see it through all the social issues, you see it through all the investment issues, but I think you're going to see it here, and here you see a circumstance where the governor, I think, of the state took the lead and made those changes and passed those regulations. I think you'll see more and more states do that. I think he did it from a strictly security and a business standpoint, because he didn't want the financial institutions to go down and then flee New York. So I think that was part of it. So I think you're going to see it on both levels. I think the government, though, will put through a series of mandates. One of the ways you'll see them do it is you'll see them do it in the supply chain. So if the federal government relies on 85% of its energy from private sources, outside of the government sources, they will, in their contracts, require that they have defense-grade cybersecurity protections in place. They be installed, they be monitored, they be changed, you know, and that they evolve. So you'll see it come in different ways, but I don't think in this Congress or this White House you're going to get a broad agreement in any particular areas unless there's a catastrophic event.
Are there particular states that are eyeing regulations in this area?
What do you
Jack?
think?
I couldn't hear the question.
Are there particular states that are eyeing regulation in this area?
No state comes to mind right now. And I will say one thing with regard to what Mike's comments were. I don't disagree that some of the states are going to have to take a more aggressive standpoint there, really to kind of step up as New York has. What I am a little concerned about, however, is the willingness of states to do that. Mm-hmm. And I really do think that, unfortunately, we seem to learn as a society and a culture after the fact. And I still think that in many cases, it will take another catastrophic or another well, I won't use catastrophic, but another very big cyber event or a series of cyber events to get the states to kind of move off the dime where they are right now. New York, I think, is an anomaly, frankly.
Yep.
So, you know, I would say, having been on the losing end of the fight over cybersecurity regulation in the Obama administration, very much doubt that we're going to see regulation as a big push in the Republican White House. I think we'll see a couple things that are going to happen over the next 2 years that will tell us that. The independent regulatory agencies that have the authority, many of them have been moving forward on new regulations. That's under leadership that was appointed in the Obama years. And so the question is, what happens to those regulations, particularly in the financial sector, at the point at which there's new leadership appointed by a Republican president, confirmed by a Republican Senate? And so I'm not optimistic that we're going to see regulation as a driver of cybersecurity spending in this market. What I've been surprised that we haven't seen on the flip side, right? I teach public policy, so public policy 101, right? Democrats have one solution to any problem: regulate it. Republicans have another: tax credits, tax cuts, right? I'm very surprised that we really haven't seen any steam behind efforts to say, how can we use tax law, tax code to bring more money into cybersecurity, right? So when we're dealing with things like the utilities, right, many of the utilities are regulated at the state level. They have price controls that limit how much money they can charge to their customers. How you get Pepco, which has to spend money on doing things like trimming trees, which they know are going to fall on power lines, to also spend money to protect their networks and the grid from Russian hackers, that's something that probably can't come out of their bottom line. And so finding a way to provide that kind of almost ratepayer relief, either through the tax code or some kind of fee or some kind of subsidy, I think is absolutely necessary. And I've been surprised that the Republican Congress has not wanted to move in that direction.
Jack, what do you think of that approach? The tax credit approach?
I think that's still problematic right now. I don't think that we're there. And I'm not sure that this administration is going to be desirous of making those changes to the tax code. I just don't think it's going to come.
So there have been a number of kind of external events that have shaped people's thinking on cybersecurity. The most recent one, obviously, being the Wannacry attacks over last week, or the last week or so. What is your read at this point as to whether or not that's affecting the policy conversation? Because certainly it's affected kind of the global conversation. I don't know, Mike, are you seeing that affect the conversation at the policy level yet?
So it's hard to figure out, what kind of policies are being thought about in the White House at this point. There's so much other activities taking place that it's a distraction. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to get a focus on what the new policies are. I can tell you that I think everybody in Washington, if not outside of Washington, are intensely focused on cyber because of the role that it played in the last election, because of the attacks that continue. I think that you're going to see coming out of some of the discussions, some of the hearings that are taking place, a potential that if those hearings are being held for real policy reasons, potential of taking a look at what has now become the 17th vertical of cybersecurity, or of critical infrastructure, which is elections. Mm-hmm. And I believe I'm right when I say that the Department of Homeland Security has now defined as a 17th vertical for that. And I think you'll see some policies, I hope, come through on that, rather than just leaving it to the two political parties and the individual candidates and the rest to protect themselves.
Yeah. Rob, wondering what you think of that, given that your former sort of big boss obviously experienced his own campaign hacking issues, and now we saw obviously a much more significant one in 2016. Do you see anything sort of productive coming out of the kind of post-Russian hacking conversation, or is it going to stay as sort of a political/intelligence debate? Not to belittle it, that's really important. I'm just wondering if people are actually going to make policies to prevent these kinds of things from happening in the future.
No.
Okay.
That's the short answer. I mean, the long answer is to say that many of us in the community said, look, Trump's got to get on top of this, because if he doesn't respond forcefully to Russia in 2020, the Mexican cyber army will come after him. The Chinese will come after him, right? We don't want to see.
What happened to the Syrian Electronic Army? Are they still out there?
That's a good question. Do we have anybody from Threat Intel out there? No?
Yeah, they're out there.
They're
Still out there. It's likely that if we can't make this kind of activity something that countries understand they simply cannot do, interfering with our elections is something that is, a hostile act that the U.S. is going to punish. If Russia doesn't get that message and the rest of the world doesn't see that message coming through clearly and loudly and publicly, we're very likely to see interference from other countries in our next election, right? I've been looking for somebody to show evidence that the Chinese who had hacked the 2008 and the 2012 elections were involved in any way in 2016. Very surprised that they weren't. They always were getting caught. It certainly wouldn't be activity that'd be covered by the agreement not to hack for intellectual property that President Obama and President Xi signed. So very odd that it seems they sat this one out. I think we'll see them back in 2020 if we don't have a forceful response.
Jack, what's your read?
I would have to agree with Rob. I don't think the problem's going to go away. I think that we look at this kind of meddling in our political affairs or in the political affairs of the French election or the German election or whatever election. It's not really any different than what has been going on for many, many, many years prior to even a computer being invented. Country A has always been interested in the elections of country B, especially if country B is an adversary state. So you want to make sure that the people in country B that are getting elected are people that are close to your heart and believe what you believe, and they'll give you a fair shake. So countries have been playing this game probably all the way back to the dawn of time. We're just now doing it with more sophisticated tools. Certainly, we saw in the French election, I believe, an attempt and a continuing attempt by the Russians to influence that election. I think we have a German election coming up soon. I expect we're going to see similar activities. I agree with Rob. I'm surprised the Chinese haven't shown their fingerprints in earlier elections. I think that we kind of see the Chinese more than we see the Russians historically in cyber operations because the Chinese may not be as sophisticated and their tradecraft may be a little bit less impressive or less developed as the Russian tradecraft. But at the end of the day, I look at the whole cyber election of 2016 as a game changer, but it wasn't because it's really the same thing that's been going on. The interesting thing is going to be what will our reaction be, how we're going to deal with that. I think the cyber story doesn't go away. I did a speech on this back in October. I thought it would run 30 days, and that would be the end of the story. It just keeps going on. It's kind of like eczema. It just keeps coming back and coming back. So I think we're now at a point where the cyber election of 2016 is now taking on criminal ramifications for the president and for people that are around him. So I don't think the Russians thought that was going to happen, but it certainly is. So film an 11 on this one.
But the sort of the implicit issue that you're both raising, or all three of you really, is sort of the notion of deterrence, which has always been a challenging thing in cyberspace, right? And having spent a lot of time covering national security issues and cybersecurity is a piece of that, generally that was discussed in terms of, war fighting and how you do deterrence in that zone. Here, we're talking about it more in the zone of get out of our elections, don't mess with us in our elections. What if someone were going to sort of make a serious run at trying to do deterrence for the 2020 elections, or 2018, or the German election, whatever? Let's pick 2020 because it gives us a little more time. What would that look like?
So, I mean, this is the real challenge, right? I think the Obama administration's immediate reaction post the election was go to the China playbook, right? How are they able to change China's behavior on economic espionage, which I believe that we did quite successfully. Well, that's a very different situation, right? China was this rising power that wanted a seat on the global stage, that wanted a trade relationship with the United States, that wanted help on North Korea, that wanted a peaceful resolution of the Spratly Islands. They had all these interests in a relationship with the United States. And so at the point at which the US government and the president himself made cybersecurity activity by China the #1 issue in the bilateral relationship, it was only a matter of time, however 5 years, that it got the Chinese to change their behavior. taking that playbook and applying it to Russia, sanctioning Russian economic interests, probably had no effect. I mean, Russia is a declining power. It's a regional power, right? It has no significant economic relationship with the United States. And so it's really hard to figure out what are the levers that the US has over Russia, which may be in part why we haven't seen really significant activity in the Trump administration on trying to address Russian cyber intrusions.
Jack or Mike?
No, go ahead. Oh, I would agree. I think Russia is a declining power, although they're trying hard not to be. It's an incredibly rich country with regard to petro rubles, but nobody wants their petro right now. Oil is cheap, natural gas is cheap. So what they have and what they can play with is essentially play money, and nobody cares about it. I think that the situation with the Russians is they still view cyber as an important part of their offensive ability to project power. I mean, they have one aircraft carrier, the Kuznetsov. It's a bucket of bolts. It steamed and huffed and puffed its way all the way to the Syrian coast and ran a few sorties, but they can't really do much. Their GDP is less than Italy right now. So they are a declining power. But they play the cards with what they have been dealt. And if you look at their doctrine is to use cyber and to influence their political rivals, their political enemies, and also to find a way to project power that they can't do in traditional kinetic ways. It's very easy for them to try and influence an election or to try and support a candidate in another country, and they can get a better bang for their ruble than by possibly invading the Donbass, which they've done in the last couple of years. So I think that the Russians will still be a player. They view the whole cyber sector as part of their theory of hybrid warfare, which was espoused by the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Gennady Gerasimov, about 7 years ago. And they're going to continue to do that. Putin feels that he's got a very, very powerful, and I think he has a fairly effective cyber force, especially in his alliance with the Russian Business Network, which is Russian organized crime. And they're going to be a player. And I don't think there's much we can do. Like you said, with the Chinese, we could do some things because they're a rising power. They have interests that really are in some ways, very concomitant with ours. The Russians don't have interests that are concomitant with ours.
So, Mike, we can't do anything?
So what you're hearing, I think this is really an excellent discussion, is that in the case of where we are engaging with a superpower like China, we're able to get some good results, or at least on the road to some good results. Where we're not engaged, and given the state of affairs in the country now, we will not be engaged in the give and take that is required of diplomacy with the Russians. What do we do about our elections? We have to think of two things. Number one, we have to make sure that they can't break in to the 50 states. So remember, elections are run by the states. Even the federal elections are run by the states. They're run by the Secretary of States largely, and they've got systems there. We have to make sure that they can't get into those systems to alter the actual vote. So I don't believe that there's been any, that I know of, any evidence that they were able to do that in this last election, where they were able to actually alter votes. But if you don't think they're not trying, then I got something to really sell you. Okay, so we have to sit with the 50 secretaries of state. We have got to get some uniform ways in which to operate to harden those systems so that we can be very sure that they aren't altering the vote. Secondly, we've got to have a program for the national parties. So if you think of the way the parties are set up, you have the National Party, the RNC, the DNC. You've got below that the 50 state parties, and then below that you have all the candidates. So what I think is being looked at is a modules to protect the National Party and their information and the way they operate. That would then deliver a module down to the state parties to protect them, and then a module that can be adopted by the candidates to protect their systems. Now, that's really easy for me to say.
Who's going to do that?
Difficult to get it done. Well, it's being done with one party. It started with one party. Whether they get there or not, I don't know, because there's a lot of other issues that are distracting the party. But that's the concept. That's the best concept I think we can come up with. And there's one firm here today that's working on those kinds of things with one of the parties to try to make sure that we can harden those systems. So you want to take it into the party system, because it was the DNC that was attacked. It was the RNC that was attacked. The state parties have an enormous amount of data. They're going to be all connected. So if the internet, or the internet of everything, they're going to be interconnected to the national party. So you want to protect it at that level, and then you want to go down one more level and provide a module at reasonable cost to candidates to be able to protect their information at their levels as well, if they want it. Again, you can't impose it necessarily on the candidates. But I think you need to look at it in those two pieces, because you're not going to get the kind of diplomacy with Russia that they were so successful with China.
That's interesting.
I'd like to add, if I could,
sorry, go for it.
just to add to Mike's point, I think you'll even have to take that down one grade lower, down to the vendors that are going to deal with the parties.
Yes, exactly.
They're going to deal with the candidates, because if you look at something like the Target breach, the bad guys got in through a vendor, and they're always looking for that weakest link. With regard to the states, I think there were 24 states that were probed.
Yes.
Looks like by GRU and FSB operatives, APTs 28 and 29 were probing 24 states. I believe they may have made some footprints into Arizona and Illinois.
Is that right?
But there doesn't seem to have been any adverse effect to that. So, good for the states. Don't know why the Russians weren't there, but they were certainly snooping around.
We have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions?
Thank you. My question is, this is 180 days in. We still have 1,000 days in the administration left, more. What do you think is the single biggest opportunity for this administration, either in terms of engaging the private sector or internally with some of the shared services and assessments he's doing internally within the federal government?
So they've got to engage the private sector. The private sector owns critical infrastructure. If they don't engage the private sector, then the critical infrastructure goes down. Now, I think there's a couple of things they can do internally, though. And I think one of them is if we're going to have public-private partnerships that are going to work, I think they need to take a look at the authorities of the intelligence community and change those authorities. Because right now they're not adequate enough to deliver what is necessary for the private sector to be able to protect themselves. Because the government can't play a role, they can't defend it, but they can deliver information, they can deliver share. I mean, there's a whole series of things the government can do, but right now they're constrained because the authorities that they have are old. They go back 5 years, 6 years.
What are some of the new authorities that they would?
Well, there has got to. I'll give you a general idea. There's got to be a set of authorities that insert trust into the exchange of data between the government and private businesses. And those authorities would probably say something. Again, I know I've never been in government. I think Rob has a better sense of what those might be. But if the government is the greatest collector of data, I would believe. And that data sometimes just sits there and never gets to the people who are required to defend critical infrastructure. Sometimes the ability to be able to exchange that data is impacted by what authorities they have to be able to do certain things. So I think I think that has to change in order to be able to do that. But ultimately, to answer your question, if you can't protect the critical infrastructure, if the grid goes down for 3 months, I mean, shared services inside the government don't mean anything.
So if I was going to just double down on what Mike said, I mean, the real issue, we spend a lot of time focusing on how we get the information government has to private companies so they can protect themselves, right? The problem with that model, I think we made a lot of progress on that, but one of the problems with that is the intelligence community is very much focused on traditional national security threats and informing the president so he can make better decisions. There really isn't a focus on saying, who do we need to go out and collect on so we can get the actors who are targeting critical infrastructure and make sure that we're doing what those private companies can't, right? Private companies can't go out and break into foreign networks and figure out who they're targeting. US government can do that. So I think of finding or some other approach that made that part of NSA's mission, CIA's mission, would go a very long way into giving private companies the information they need.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Robert Anderson, CenturyLink. Just a couple comments. One, going back to what Jack said on the disinformation campaigns that have been going on for eons concerning interfering with elections. The U.S. has been doing that in multiple countries forever, just as Russia has. Russia hasn't had that many elections, except for the last few years. But in every election, and the one that's upcoming, you better believe that we're going to be doing something to influence that election. Just one quick question on infrastructure and critical infrastructure. What do you think the impact of the FERC and NERC regulations that came out 2 or 3 years ago and that were enacted last year, how have they impacted the overall security of our critical infrastructure?
Jack, do you have a sense of that?
No.
No? Okay. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue for a lot of the utilities just comes down to money. They need more money in order to be able to implement these rules, right? And so I think we've actually seen better adoption if you look at the GAO reports that have examined the pickup on the NERC rules. Many of them, however, remain voluntary. And so I'm not sure that simply by increasing mandates that are unfunded, we're actually going to get better security in this area. I think what we really need isn't compliance, but it's to get these companies to a point where they're proactively managing their risk, where they're hunting in their networks for threats. That's very expensive to do, right? It's not something that I know many utilities are capable of doing. So it's not just about standards, it's about changing that dynamic so they value security and they have the money to invest in it.
Great. I think that's about all the time we have. I would just, one quick probability question for each of the panelists. We had 2 pretty interesting solutions put on the table, one for election, sort of protecting the next set of elections, and another around new intelligence authorities. What are the probabilities of either of those happening? We'll just go down the line.
Well, I think that the issue of the intelligence community and the intelligence community working with the private sector has been one that it dogged me when I was in office. I would go around the country. I remember coming up to the city and sitting with senior executives of the NBA. And they said, we operate all of these basketball arenas around the country. We have millions of people every year, and you guys don't tell us anything about threat. And these were guys who were essentially former Secret Service agents. They had been feds. And I heard this time and time again, that those of us who are in the intelligence community are just playing everything too close to the vest. We have tried. I really, really believe we tried really hard when I was in office to do that. But you know, people come and go in the community. You know, you're there for 3 years, you move on, a new guy comes in. He's like, we're not doing that anymore, and things change again. It's all about relationships, it's about trust. And when people move around the government, sometimes that hurts. I want to say one other thing, too, with regard to probabilities. When I read the executive order, and I don't think it's a bad executive order. It's okay. It's not too bad. But the one thing that just kind of jumped off the page for me is like, who's going to pay for this? You know, there's great stuff there, but I don't know how we're going to pay for it.
Exactly.
My quick probability.
So I think we've got some probability at hardening the systems for the parties. I think we do. I think there's people that don't want that information to go out. I think there's something, if you want to think about something really cool that might happen here, is hot pursuit. Okay, so right now it's against the law for private companies to do hot pursuit, but I wonder if this administration is going to open up hot pursuit. It would be chaotic. but it's very interesting because will there be letters of marque? Will there be attribution? Will there be freedom to operate so that companies can protect themselves by going back against the people that have attacked them? Again, I don't know whether that's good policy, bad policy. I'll leave it to the policymakers, but there's a lot of discussion now among companies saying if we're spending all this money to protect ourselves, why can't we spend some money to go after the guys that have come after us? Because the government doesn't appear to be doing it, is kind of how they look at it.
Quick probability assessment. You get the last word.
I think it's low probability across the board from what we're seeing right now. It's taking so much time to just stand up and study these problems. The administration's so bogged down in other areas that I doubt we're going to see major significant changes. So that's my guess.
On that cheerful note, thank you so much.
I mean, it's a whole issue.